shattered by an aggressive knock on the door. A group of self-appointed HOA security agents tried to unlawfully evict us without a court order. Natalie, my wife, and a former Navy commander stepped up with calm authority and quickly exposed their lack of legal power. When they tried to get physical, Natalie handled them effortlessly, leaving one pin to the porch. With the sheriff on the way and the neighborhood watching, it became clear this battle would not end the way the HOA expected. The story unfolded like this, and we invite you to listen closely to how one morning changed everything for our family. It started with a deafening pounding on the front door, so forceful it rattled the windows and made my heart leap out of my chest. Coffee sloshed onto my shirt as I jumped up from the breakfast table, startled and disoriented. Natalie, unfazed, stayed seated, her Navy instincts keeping her calm as always. Before I could even wipe my hands, another round of pounding came, louder and faster, as if whoever was outside thought sheer force would break the door down. Our two kids peeked wide-eyed from behind the kitchen counter, their faces frozen in fear. I rushed to the peephole, half expecting to see police or firefighters, but instead I saw three burly men in cheap black polos that said HOA Security in gaudy gold letters. They clutched a clipboard and some kind of printed notice, standing with aggressive stances like they were ready to bust in. I cracked the door just a sliver, enough to speak, but not enough for them to see inside. The biggest one shoved the clipboard through the gap, thrusting an eviction notice in my face. He barked about an unauthorized structure and claimed we had 1 hour to vacate before they forcibly removed us. Confused beyond words, I stammered, thinking about our simple backyard treehouse and the fact that we owned the house outright. Before I could form a question, another man barked that time was ticking. Behind me, I heard the steady footsteps of Natalie rising from her chair. She walked toward the door with the measured calm of someone stepping into a war room, not a panic. She gently nudged me aside, opened the door wider, and faced them squarely. Instinctively, the three men straightened, sensing her command without needing a uniform to see it. She asked them to state their legal authority to evict us without a court order. The lead thug blustered about the HOA's authority, but Natalie cut him off coldly, explaining eviction required a legal judgment and sworn officers, not contractors hired to play rent-a-cop. They shifted nervously, one staring at his shoes. Natalie took one slow step forward and declared that if they stayed, they were trespassing and committing harassment under state law. You could almost see the realization dawning on their faces that they had messed with the wrong house. Still, stupidity prevailed, and one of them lunged forward to grab Natalie's arm. What happened next was so fast it barely registered. In one breath, he grabbed her, and in the next, he was face down on the porch with Natalie's knee digging between his shoulders and his arm twisted painfully behind his back. The other two backed up with their hands half raised, shouting for her not to hurt him. Natalie, still cool and controlled, informed them calmly that assaulting a homeowner was a felony and advised them to call their supervisors because criminal charges were imminent. I finally managed to get my hands steady enough to dial the sheriff's office, reporting an attempted unlawful eviction and physical assault. While I was on the phone, more HOA vehicles arrived, 2 more men spilling out looking utterly bewildered at the scene unfolding on our porch. 5 of them now stood on our front lawn, whispering among themselves, unsure whether to step in or pretend they had never met the guy face down on the boards. Meanwhile, neighbors had started peeking through their blinds and cracking open doors, some even filming. Natalie stood firm, addressing the newcomers with the same crisp authority, warning that any further attempt to enter the property would result in detention until law enforcement arrived. No one dared cross the line she drew with her stance and her words. The sweet sound of sirens began to swell in the distance, the promise of backup growing louder with every heartbeat. Finally realizing the battle was lost, the goons grabbed their fallen friend and shuffled back toward the street like cowards abandoning a sinking ship. Natalie remained on the porch, arms folded, her chin lifted just slightly in a stance that radiated unshakable strength. From the window, I saw our kids staring at her with awe, and I gave them a thumbs up to let them know we were safe. As the first sheriff's cruiser rounded the corner, the head goon made one last pathetic attempt, waving a piece of paper and shouting that we were in violation and refusing citations. His voice cracked, and it would have been laughable if it were not so desperate. The deputy, a stocky woman with mirrored sunglasses and a world-weary look, stepped out of her car without even glancing at the shouting man. More cruisers pulled up behind her, and suddenly there were 6 deputies securing the scene. The lead deputy approached Natalie directly, completely ignoring the HOA clowns, and respectfully asked if she was the homeowner who called. Natalie produced her military ID with a crisp nod, and the deputy's demeanor shifted subtly, recognizing the authority behind the card. Natalie laid out the facts with surgical precision, detailing the unlawful eviction attempt, the assault, and the threats made against our family. Deputies moved in, ordering the HOA men away from their vehicles and keeping them in clear sight. Watching the so-called security try to explain themselves was almost pathetic, one babbling about emergency protocols until the deputy sharply told him to be quiet if he valued his freedom. Another tried to wave around the worthless eviction notice, but it was immediately dismissed. I ducked inside briefly to check on the kids, who were now smiling, the fear draining away as they realized we had this under control. Our son whispered that Mom was like a superhero, and honestly, he was not wrong. By the time I returned to the doorway, the HOA men were being read a list of potential charges: attempted unlawful eviction, harassment, trespassing, and assault. One of them, in a final burst of foolishness, tried to make a run for it but was tackled flat onto the grass within 3 steps. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut was the sweetest noise I had heard all morning. Natalie, ever composed, leaned in close to the lead deputy and quietly mentioned prior harassment, fake violations, and her communication with a contact in the military's legal corps. The deputy's eyebrows lifted again, and she called for her supervisor immediately, understanding this case was about to escalate beyond simple assault charges. As the arrested HOA men were loaded into cruisers and driven off, a black SUV with government plates rolled up to the curb. Out stepped a man in a dark suit flashing a badge from the Attorney General's office. He conferred briefly with the deputies, then approached Natalie directly. He asked if she had documentation of prior HOA abuses. Without missing a beat, Natalie handed over a slim flash drive she had prepared ahead of time, containing recordings, letters, and every shred of evidence meticulously organized. The agent accepted it with a nod of clear respect, promising an immediate review. The irony was almost too perfect. They came to evict us with scare tactics and ended up bringing federal investigators to their own doorstep. As the last HOA truck was towed away and the neighborhood buzzed with whispers and quiet cheers, I realized this was not just the end of an attempted eviction. It was the beginning of a battle much bigger than any of us had imagined. And with Natalie leading the charge, there was no doubt in my mind that we were going to win. The morning chaos slowly settled into a tense, buzzing quiet, but the adrenaline still pumped through my veins like electricity. Even after the HOA thugs had been hauled away in squad cars, the uneasy hum of the neighborhood lingered in the air. People were peeking through blinds, some venturing onto their porches, whispering in hushed circles about what they had just witnessed. For a long moment, it felt like the whole world had shifted a few degrees off-center, and we were the only ones standing upright. Natalie stood tall on the porch, arms still crossed, her expression carved from stone, watching the last HOA vehicle being hitched up and hauled away. I could feel the wheels turning in her mind, calculating, analyzing, preparing for whatever would come next. She was not celebrating. She was strategizing. Inside, the kids clustered around her, their awe barely contained. They fired off questions faster than we could answer, asking how she had flipped the guy, how she knew what to say, whether the police were going to take him to jail forever. Natalie crouched down and reassured them in that steady, no-nonsense tone that had calmed sailors in storms far fiercer than anything we had ever seen on land. She told them we were safe, that the police were handling it, and that our job was to stay strong together as a family. Her words planted something in all of us, a quiet seed of resilience that had already started to sprout. Meanwhile, law enforcement moved efficiently, securing statements, logging evidence, photographing every inch of the porch and driveway like it was a crime scene, which, in fact, it now was. Deputies fanned out across the neighborhood, gathering accounts from the many witnesses who had seen or filmed parts of the confrontation. Several neighbors eagerly came forward with footage captured from cell phones and home security systems. Natalie handed her statement over with military precision, no fluff, no emotion clouding the facts. She laid out the unlawful attempt to evict us, the harassment tactics, the physical assault, and the clear trespassing violations, presenting it all like a seasoned officer presenting a field report. The deputies, who had probably started their shift thinking it would be a normal boring day of traffic stops and noise complaints, listened intently, recognizing the gravity of what was unfolding on our quiet suburban street. What none of us realized yet was how far and wide the consequences of that morning were about to ripple. By late afternoon, the Attorney General's investigator who had accepted Natalie's flash drive returned with a small team. They worked out of unmarked cars parked discreetly on the next block, their presence low-key but unmistakable if you knew what to look for. Natalie had anticipated their arrival as surely as she anticipated a changing wind on the deck of a battleship. She was already waiting on the porch when they arrived, files and notes meticulously organized, timelines mapped out in neat columns. She met them halfway down the driveway, radiating the same command presence that had frozen the HOA thugs in their tracks earlier. Over the next few hours, our home became an unofficial operations center. Federal investigators combed through evidence Natalie had carefully archived, documenting every threatening letter, every bogus fine notice, every hollow warning of noncompliance that had been sent our way. The deeper they dug, the uglier the picture became. The HOA had not just made a mistake with us. They had been running a calculated campaign of fear, intimidation, and financial exploitation against multiple families for years. Their tactics were simple but brutally effective. Target families they thought could not fight back. Single parents, elderly couples, military families temporarily separated by deployments. They hit them with fabricated violations, threatened liens, and used scare tactics to force payments or force them out. It was extortion, plain and simple, wrapped in a thin veneer of community management. And now, thanks to Natalie, the whole rotten operation was finally coming to light. As night fell, the neighborhood buzzed with a strange new energy. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other beyond polite nods at the mailbox were now gathering in clusters, swapping stories, and piecing together a larger picture of what had been happening behind the scenes. People shared their experiences hesitantly at first, still conditioned by years of fear, but as they realized they were not alone, the floodgates opened. One woman, a widow who lived 2 houses down, revealed that she had been threatened with foreclosure for an imaginary landscaping violation. A retired veteran showed Natalie a thick folder of letters threatening escalating fines over a crack in his driveway that had been there for decades. Another neighbor, a young single mother, tearfully admitted that she had been bullied into paying thousands in bogus compliance fees under threat of losing custody of her kids. Each news story fueled the fire growing in the hearts of everyone listening. It was no longer about our family. It was about all of us. About an entire community waking up after years of being systematically cowed into submission. Natalie listened to each account with quiet intensity, never interrupting, never brushing anyone off. She wrote down details, cross-referenced them with dates and names, building a case so methodically it almost felt like we were preparing for a military tribunal. She knew, with the same certainty she had in battle, that the strength of our case lay not just in outrage, but in proof. Hard evidence. documented abuses, patterns of behavior that could withstand legal scrutiny. Meanwhile, inside our house, the kids helped in small ways, stacking papers, fetching water bottles, feeling like part of something larger than themselves. Natalie made sure they understood what was happening, explaining it not as a battle of good versus evil, but as a stand for fairness, for law, for community. It was a lesson I knew they would carry for the rest of their lives. By midnight, we had compiled dozens of affidavits, copies of letters, video evidence, and witness statements. Natalie sent encrypted copies to the federal team and our newly retained lawyer, a bulldog of a woman named Carla who specialized in HOA abuse cases and seemed almost giddy at the prospect of tearing the corrupt organization apart. Before we collapsed into bed, Natalie stood by the window, looking out over the darkened street. She was quiet for a long time, arms folded, the weight of the day settling onto her shoulders. I asked her if she was all right, and she gave a small nod, her face unreadable in the moonlight. It was not fear I saw there. It was resolve. This was only the beginning. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different, like the first tentative breath after surviving a hurricane. People moved differently. Straighter backs, firmer steps, eye contact, hope. There were more waves, more thumbs-ups, more quiet gestures of solidarity. It was the first time in years that I saw real community glimmering under the surface of polite suburban pleasantries. Natalie did not waste a minute. She coordinated with the investigators, compiled additional documentation, and even coached some of the neighbors on how to present their statements clearly and effectively. She was operating at full battle rhythm now, moving with the cool efficiency of someone used to commanding far more chaotic operations in far more dangerous places. But her greatest strength was not just her strategy. It was the way she gave everyone around her the courage to believe they could fight back too. By noon, the story had started to spread beyond the neighborhood. A local reporter, tipped off by one of the neighbors, showed up with a camera crew, sniffing around for a juicy scandal. Natalie met them head-on, giving a short, poised statement emphasizing the facts and refusing to be drawn into sensationalism. She made it clear this was about systemic abuse, not personal vendettas. It was about a community standing together. The reporter, visibly impressed, promised to follow the story carefully. By evening, clips of Natalie speaking calmly and firmly were playing on local news stations, and our neighborhood's fight was no longer a secret. The HOA leadership, meanwhile, scrambled like rats on a sinking ship. We heard through the grapevine that emergency meetings were being held, frantic attempts to circle wagons and spin narratives. But it was too late. The walls were closing in, and no amount of spin could undo the footage, the documents, the testimonies stacking higher by the hour. That night, as we sat around a fire pit in our backyard, neighbors crowded close, warming their hands, swapping stories, and planning the next steps. Kids ran laughing between the trees, oblivious to the battle their parents were quietly waging for their future. Natalie stood by the fire, hands shoved into her pockets, surveying the gathering like a general reviewing her troops. She spoke quietly but firmly about the road ahead, about the importance of unity, of resilience, of refusing to be cowed no matter how desperate the HOA's leadership became, about standing not just for ourselves, but for the kind of community we wanted our kids to grow up in. Her words settled into the cool night air like embers, sparking a resolve in every heart gathered there. And as I looked around at the determined faces illuminated by firelight, I realized something profound. We were not just fighting to win back our own home. We were fighting to reclaim the very soul of our neighborhood. And with Natalie leading the charge, I knew beyond any shadow of a doubt that we were going to win. The days that followed felt like living on the front lines of a quiet war, each moment packed with tension that hummed just under the surface. After the initial shock of the HOA's failed eviction attempt and the federal investigation that followed, the entire neighborhood moved into a strange new phase, a mixture of cautious hope and mounting anger. It was as if someone had pulled back the curtain on a decades-long scam, and now nobody was sure how to act. At first, people tiptoed around it, offering us awkward nods and whispered thank yous. But as the federal investigators dug deeper and the local news stations picked up the story, the dam finally broke. Neighbors who had barely exchanged words for years now gathered on sidewalks and porches, drawn together by a shared sense of betrayal. Stories poured out faster than we could absorb them. One woman described how the HOA had fined her for supposedly having a non-compliant fence, even though her fence had been built by the previous homeowner with HOA approval. Another man revealed he had been threatened with foreclosure because of a supposed unpaid fine for a tree that had been planted in the wrong spot. A retired couple showed us letters they had kept hidden for years, filled with escalating threats and outrageous fees for petty, made-up violations. What once had been isolated whispers of injustice now formed a deafening chorus. It became crystal clear that this was never about maintaining neighborhood standards. It was about money, control, and intimidation. Natalie absorbed every story with the same sharp attention she had once used in military briefings. She asked careful questions, took meticulous notes, and compiled a growing archive of evidence. Every night, our dining room table transformed into a war room, covered in papers, photos, highlighted documents, and carefully labeled folders. The kids helped too, handing Natalie highlighters, sorting papers, fetching her coffee when the hours dragged on late into the night. They understood more than we realized. This was about protecting their home too. It was not long before the entire neighborhood began to pivot from fear to action. Natalie quietly built a coalition, a core group of about a dozen families who were ready to take a stand. There was the retired veteran who had lived here for 30 years and had been fined thousands for bogus reasons. There was the single mom whose driveway chalk drawings for her kids had somehow been classified as vandalism by the HOA. There was the young couple just starting out who had been threatened with legal action over the color of their front door. Each story was a thread, and Natalie wove them together into a tapestry so detailed and damning that even the most jaded investigator would have to take notice. She held informal meetings in our backyard under the soft glow of string lights and the steady hum of crickets. We passed around homemade cookies and lemonade like it was a summer barbecue, but the conversations were serious, almost electric. Natalie laid out the plan with the clarity and precision of a seasoned commander. Document everything. Record every conversation. Save every letter, every email, every voicemail. Do not engage directly with HOA representatives. Refer all communications through the attorney. Move as one, stand as one. Her voice never wavered. Her calm confidence was contagious, and slowly, the fear that had gripped our community for so long began to melt away. Word spread beyond our little coalition. Families who had once kept their heads down now approached us shyly, asking if they could join the fight. Natalie welcomed them all, no matter how small their story seemed. Every voice mattered. Every injustice added weight to the case. Every new ally was another brick in the wall we were building against the HOA's abuse. Behind the scenes, the HOA leadership grew increasingly desperate. They sent out frantic letters trying to reassert control, claiming the residents were spreading misinformation, threatening fines for defamation, threatening lawsuits against anyone who spoke out. But the more they threatened, the more obvious their fear became. Nobody was buying their lies anymore. People who once would have trembled at the sight of an HOA letter now laughed and passed them around like bad jokes. Natalie collected every single one, adding them to the growing file labeled evidence of retaliation. Federal investigators kept a close watch, quietly monitoring from a nearby van disguised as a plumber's truck. They interviewed neighbors, collected documents, and tracked the movements of the HOA board members. From time to time, we would see men in jeans and polo shirts strolling the sidewalks, casually chatting with residents, their clipboards tucked under one arm. It was surreal, like living in a real-life sting operation. But it was working. The case was building, growing stronger every day. Then came the night the HOA president made his next move. Just as Natalie had predicted, he could not help himself. power-hungry bullies rarely could. A few minutes after sunset, an expensive black SUV rolled slowly down our street, its headlights off. It parked 2 houses down, and 3 figures stepped out, walking toward our house with stiff, nervous energy. It was the HOA president and 2 board members, trying to put on a show of strength they no longer possessed. Natalie met them at the top of the porch steps, arms crossed, her body language screaming that she owned this ground, and they had no business standing on it. The president opened his mouth, probably to deliver some smug, oily speech about misunderstandings and neighborly cooperation. But Natalie cut him off before he could even begin. She informed him, calmly but firmly, that all communications must go through legal counsel. She pointed out the blinking body camera clipped to her shirt, recording every word, every twitch, every threat disguised as an olive branch. The president blustered, trying to regain footing, but the board members behind him were already wilting. One of them muttered an excuse and fled back to the SUV, the other looking like he wanted to melt into the pavement. Natalie gave them exactly 30 seconds to vacate the property. They took 20. The next day, things escalated further. Our coalition officially filed a lawsuit against the HOA for harassment, fraud, unlawful practices, and emotional distress. Carla, our attorney, moved like a woman on a mission, filing motions, issuing subpoenas, coordinating with federal investigators. Local news caught wind of the lawsuit and ran a primetime feature about the battle brewing in our suburban corner of the world. The footage of Natalie standing on our porch, firm and unshakable, played over and over, a symbol of quiet defiance. Families who had once been too scared to speak now came forward in droves. New evidence poured in daily. Leaked emails, secret audio recordings, financial statements that pointed to massive embezzlement by the HOA leadership. Every new revelation tightened the noose around their necks a little more. Meanwhile, our neighborhood changed before our eyes. Front yards that had once been meticulously manicured out of fear now bloomed with life and color. Kids played freely on sidewalks. Neighbors threw block parties. People mowed each other's lawns just because they could. No fines, no warnings, just kindness. The artificial, fearful perfection the HOA had enforced for so long crumbled, revealing something real and far more beautiful underneath. Through it all, Natalie remained steady. She kept the group focused, kept spirits high when nerves threatened to fray, kept us moving forward no matter what dirty trick the HOA tried to pull. She was the spine of the movement, the heartbeat of our resistance. And watching her, I realized something I should have known all along. This battle was not just about reclaiming our homes. It was about reclaiming our dignity, our right to live free from fear, our right to stand together against corruption, no matter how entrenched it might seem. As the summer nights grew longer and the fireflies returned to dance in the trees, we knew the storm was still gathering on the horizon. The HOA leadership was wounded, but not yet defeated. But we were ready. For the first time in a long time, we knew who we were, what we were fighting for, and what we were willing to sacrifice to protect it. And with Natalie leading the way, none of us had any doubt that we would see this fight through to the end. The tension had been building for days, thickening in the air like an approaching storm, and when it finally broke, it did so with the force of a thunderclap. We had all known it was coming, had seen the signs, the desperate moves by the HOA leadership as the walls closed in on them, but still, nothing could have prepared us for the way it exploded. It was a quiet evening, the sky painted in rich shades of purple and gold, when the first blow landed. We had just sat down for dinner, plates piled high with grilled chicken and fresh vegetables from the garden, when a rock the size of a grapefruit smashed through our living room window with a deafening crash. The kids screamed and ducked under the table, and I instinctively threw myself across them, shielding their small bodies with mine while shards of glass rained down around us. Natalie was already moving before I could even blink, springing from her chair and racing to the front door with the precision of a woman trained for emergencies far worse than this. She flung the door open and scanned the street with a cold, sharp gaze, but whoever had thrown the rock was already tearing away in a dark car, tires screeching as they disappeared into the twilight. It did not matter. The unmarked van parked a few houses down, the one that belonged to the federal investigators monitoring the HOA's activities, had caught everything on camera. Within minutes, deputies arrived, the flashing red and blue lights slicing through the dusk, illuminating the shattered remains of our window and the terror still lingering in the kids' wide eyes. They swept the scene methodically, photographing the damage, dusting the rock for fingerprints, taking statements from us and the neighbors who had witnessed the attack. Natalie stood silently by the broken window, her arms folded, her body vibrating with a fury so controlled it was almost more frightening than if she had screamed. I could see the way she blamed herself for not anticipating this retaliation, for not protecting the kids better. But there was no way she could have known. Cowards did not announce their attacks. They hid in the shadows, struck when backs were turned, and ran before they could face the consequences. One of the deputies, an older man with a grizzled beard and the kind of heavy-lidded eyes that said he had seen too much in his life, put a firm hand on Natalie's shoulder and told her she was doing everything right. That if anything, the HOA leadership had just sealed their own fate by crossing the line from harassment into violence. Natalie nodded once, tightly, and turned back to the task at hand. No time for pity, no time for anger. There was still work to do. The next morning, the federal team made their move. Before the sun even had a chance to fully rise, a convoy of unmarked SUVs and sheriff's cruisers rolled onto our street like an invading army. Neighbors gathered on porches and sidewalks, clutching coffee mugs and filming with trembling hands as the agents poured into the HOA president's home. They moved with a brutal efficiency, hauling out box after box of documents, computers, hard drives, and evidence bags stuffed with God knows what else. The president himself, the once smug man who had stood on our walkway barking threats and false authority, was marched out in handcuffs, his expensive golf shirt soaked in sweat, his face pale and slack with disbelief. He tried to shout something as he was led past our house, something about being set up, about how this was all a mistake, but nobody was listening. Not the agents, not the neighbors, not even his own board members who watched from a distance with blank, shell-shocked faces. Natalie stood on our porch, arms crossed, her expression calm and unreadable, and when the president's eyes met hers, he stumbled slightly, as if realizing in that moment exactly who had orchestrated the downfall he never saw coming. It did not end with him. Arrests followed quickly, a domino effect of panic and betrayal. One by one, board members were picked up, charged with everything from fraud to racketeering to conspiracy to commit unlawful eviction. Their expensive cars were towed away. Their bank accounts were frozen. Their carefully crafted lives, built on fear and extortion, crumbled into dust within hours. Watching it unfold was deeply satisfying, not because we wanted revenge, but because justice was finally being served. But even more powerful than watching the guilty fall was watching what rose up in their place. That evening, the neighborhood gathered in the local park, the one they had tried to seize for their development deal. String lights hung from trees, kids played freely on the grass, and the air buzzed with a hope so strong it was almost tangible. Natalie was asked to speak first, and she did so with the same quiet strength she had shown throughout the battle. She spoke about standing up against corruption, about the power of community, about how ordinary people, when united, could achieve extraordinary things. She did not sugarcoat the struggle, did not pretend it had been easy, but she made it clear that it had been worth it. People cried. People cheered. And when she finished speaking, they gave her a standing ovation that lasted for minutes, a wave of gratitude and respect that washed over her and left her blinking back tears she would never let fall in public. Later that night, the neighborhood voted unanimously to dissolve the HOA permanently. The land deal collapsed within days, once the developers realized there was no corrupt leadership left to push it through. Our homes were safe. Our future was ours again. But the battle had done more than protect our property. It had transformed us. The fake politeness and surface-level niceties that had once defined our interactions had been replaced by something real, something lasting. Neighbors knew each other now, trusted each other, helped each other. Without the HOA's iron grip strangling every interaction, real community blossomed. People who had once lived in isolation now gathered for barbecues, organized volunteer cleanups, hosted movie nights in backyards. Kids rode bikes up and down the streets without parents watching with hawk-like paranoia. Fences were mended without fines. Lawns were mowed out of kindness, not fear. Disagreements were handled with conversations, not threats. And at the heart of it all was Natalie. Not a leader in the traditional sense, not someone who sought power or recognition, but someone whose presence alone gave people courage. She never accepted praise easily. Whenever someone thanked her, she pointed it back to the group, to the simple truth that it was the community itself that had reclaimed its freedom. Still, there was no denying the change in how people looked at her. With admiration, with trust, with a deep understanding that if trouble ever came knocking again, she would be the one standing in the doorway, ready to fight. As for the old HOA leadership, their fates were sealed. The federal prosecutors moved swiftly, cutting no deals for the president or his inner circle. The evidence was too overwhelming, the damage too great. Most of them accepted plea deals to avoid decades in prison, but even the lighter sentences could not save them from the destruction of their reputations, their finances, their lives. The president himself was sentenced to 12 years in prison for conspiracy, racketeering, fraud, and a half-dozen other charges. Watching him led away in an orange jumpsuit, head bowed, was more satisfying than any Hollywood movie ending could ever be. A few weeks later, in a final twist of irony, the very land he had schemed to seize was awarded to the community as part of a civil settlement. It was transformed into a public park, dedicated to the elderly couple who had suffered most under the HOA's reign of terror. Natalie was asked to cut the ribbon at the opening ceremony. She tried to wave off the attention, but the community would not let her. The mayor showed up. Local news stations aired live coverage. Kids held up handmade signs thanking Commander Natalie and draped her in more construction paper medals than any decorated veteran could ever wear. Life settled into a new rhythm after that, one that felt lighter, freer, more alive. Our backyard became the unofficial gathering place, with families drifting over every evening to share food, laughter, and the simple joy of being together without fear. The treehouse, once just a modest platform between two oaks, grew into a towering two-story fortress built by the collective efforts of dads and moms who wanted to give their kids a place to dream big and feel safe. They called it Commander's Fort and hung a wooden plaque proudly from its railing. One evening, sitting on the porch swing with Natalie as the stars spun slowly overhead, I asked her if she missed the Navy. She was quiet for a long time before answering. "Sometimes," she said. "I miss the clarity, the purpose. You always knew your mission. But this," she added, her voice softening as she looked out at the park lit up with laughter and music, "this feels just as important." And as I wrapped an arm around her shoulders, feeling the warm night air settle around us, I knew she was right. She had never really left command. She had simply found a new battlefield, one closer to home, one that mattered just as much. And whatever battles might come next, we knew we would face them together, stronger than ever, undefeated and unbreakable. The days after the battle ended were the quietest we had ever known, but not the kind of quiet that comes from fear or waiting for the next blow. It was a different kind of stillness, a deep, peaceful exhale after years of holding our breath. The weight that had pressed down on the neighborhood for so long was finally gone, lifted as cleanly and completely as if someone had turned a key and unlocked invisible chains. People who had once hurried from their cars to their front doors without making eye contact now lingered outside, laughing, waving, stopping to talk. Kids rode their bikes up and down the streets with shrieks of joy that echoed off houses once shuttered by suspicion. Porch lights stayed on late into the evening, not because of fear, but because nobody wanted to go back inside. Our backyard, which had once been a private little refuge, became the heart of something bigger. Night after night, families drifted over with folding chairs and coolers, children tumbling across the lawn like puppies, while adults sat in circles, trading stories and sharing food. What started as a few families quietly celebrating victory grew into something much more powerful, a community finding itself again, reknitting the bonds that had frayed under years of fear and intimidation. It was messy and loud and imperfect, but it was real. For the first time in what felt like forever, it was real. Natalie never tried to stand in the spotlight. If anything, she shrank from the attention, always redirecting the gratitude and admiration toward the neighborhood itself. She would shrug and say it was everyone's fight, that everyone had stood up. But the truth everyone knew, even if they did not always say it out loud, was that none of it would have happened without her. She had been the catalyst, the backbone, the unwavering heart of it all. People looked at her differently now, not just with admiration, but with trust so deep it ran down to the bone. If trouble ever came back to our street, there was no doubt who would be standing at the front lines. The old HOA leadership, the bullies who had built their little empire on fear, were done for good. The federal case against them moved swiftly. No delays, no mercy. The evidence was overwhelming. Secret accounts, fabricated violations, thousands of dollars siphoned from the very people they were supposed to protect. Most of them cut plea deals, trading their freedom for lighter sentences, but even then, their lives were over in every way that mattered. The former president, the man who had once swaggered around our streets barking orders, was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Watching him be led away in shackles during the televised court hearing felt almost surreal, like the closing scene of a movie you had not dared hope would end the way it should. The final blow came when the land he had schemed so hard to steal was awarded to the community. Instead of becoming another soulless development, it was turned into a public park, a place for families to gather, kids to play, and neighbors to remember that they were stronger together than apart. Fittingly, the park was named after the elderly couple who had suffered most at the hands of the HOA, a quiet testament to resilience and hope. Natalie was asked to cut the ribbon at the park's opening ceremony. She tried to turn it down, of course, uncomfortable with the idea of standing alone in the spotlight. But the neighborhood would not hear of it. They surrounded her, lifted her up, made it clear that whatever discomfort she felt, she had earned this moment 100 times over. The mayor showed up, local news crews buzzed around, and kids waved handmade signs that said things like "Thank you, Commander Natalie and our hero." They hung construction paper medals around her neck until she looked like a champion returning home from war. And in a way, she was. She had fought for all of us, and she had won. Life after that settled into a rhythm that felt almost too good to be true. The kids played in the newly built Commander's Fort, a 2-story treehouse fortress in our backyard that had become a neighborhood landmark. Built by the hands of dozens of dads and moms who just wanted to give their kids something to believe in, it stood as a monument to what we could accomplish when we worked together. On summer nights, the air filled with the sounds of laughter and music drifting from backyard parties. Disagreements, when they happened, were handled with conversations and compromise, not threats and fines. Without the suffocating weight of the HOA's dictatorship, we remembered how to be neighbors, how to be friends, how to be human again. One evening, sitting out on the porch swing with Natalie, wrapped in a shared blanket against the crisp night air, I asked her if she missed her old life. She was quiet for a long time, watching the stars spin slowly overhead, the distant sounds of children laughing in the park mixing with the gentle rustle of leaves. Sometimes, she said at last, "I miss the clarity, the simplicity of knowing your mission, of having a chain of command and a clear enemy." But then she turned to me and smiled, a small, fierce smile that still stole the breath from my lungs after all these years. "But this," she said, "this matters just as much. Protecting our home, protecting our neighbors, standing up for what is right even when it is hard. It feels just as important as anything I ever did in uniform." I kissed the top of her head and pulled her closer, feeling the deep, solid peace that had been missing for so long settle into my bones. We sat there together for a long time, watching the neighborhood breathe and live and heal around us. The truth is, they had tried to break us. They had tried to silence us with fear, to bully us into submission, to strip away our dignity one threat at a time. But all they had done was forge us into something stronger than we had ever been before. They had forgotten that courage is not about never being afraid. It is about standing up even when your knees are shaking. About speaking out even when your voice trembles. About holding the line when every part of you wants to run. They had forgotten who they were dealing with. And in the end, it was not just about winning a battle over property lines or neighborhood rules. It was about reclaiming something far greater. It was about taking back the right to live free, to love fiercely, to build something lasting with the people around you. It was about showing our kids, our neighbors, and ourselves that when you stand together, there is no force in the world that can tear you apart. As the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead, Natalie whispered something so low I almost missed it. A final promise etched into the fabric of everything we had fought for. "They thought they could scare us into running," she said. "But all they did was teach us how to stand." And so we sat there, wrapped in the warmth of the night, listening to the steady, unbreakable heartbeat of a community reborn, knowing that whatever storms might come in the future, we would face them together. Unafraid, unshaken, absolutely undefeated.